So you've heard about embryo donation, and you might be wondering, well, what is embryo adoption and how does it work? Well, stay tuned and we'll get right into it. Hello, I'm Corlandos Scott, and I'm an assisted reproduction attorney in Los Angeles, and I've dedicated my practice to helping hopeful parents navigate the assisted reproduction process, doing things just like embryo adoption. And in this video, we're going to talk about exactly what that process looks like. So stay tuned. Today, we're going to talk about the difference between embryo adoption and typical child adoption. We'll answer the question, do typical adoption laws apply to embryo adoption? I'll introduce you to something called snowflake babies, and we'll look at laws specific to embryo adoption. Hey, and I have a free gift, so make sure you stay until the end so you can get your hands on the free gift. So you may be wondering, is the embryo adoption process similar to that of typical child adoption process? Well, I should probably say this at the very beginning. A lot of people refer to embryo adoption without realizing that in many circumstances, it's pretty much the same as embryo donation. There is no specific thing called embryo adoption. Why? Adoption is a technical, legal word that addresses giving up custody of a living, breathing child from one parent to another. But for the sake of our conversation, let's continue to talk about embryo adoption. The reason why many people refer to how they received embryos as embryo adoption is because of where they received the embryos. Many people adopt or get donated embryos from an agency. And the way the agency goes about getting the donation done is very similar in practice to how adoption agencies work. So let's look at the differences and the similarities. Just like with a child adoption agency, embryo adoption agencies typically pre-screen or screen the recipients of the embryos. That's definitely one similarity. This is where the two experiences kind of diverge. In a typical adoption, the experience is much different because you'll be gaining custody of a living baby or child. However, in the embryo adoption process, you'll be either receiving embryos to carry yourself as the expected mother, or you'll be receiving embryos to use with the help of a gestational carrier, or surrogate as they're called, to have the surrogate carry the child to delivery. Speaking of surrogacy, if you haven't already seen it, you've got to check out my video on the surrogacy process. So make sure you click the button below to subscribe, click the bell so you get alerts of when we do new videos, and go check out that surrogacy process video. So the question rises, do typical adoption laws apply to embryo adoption? And the simple answer again is no. Why? Because adoption laws apply to the placement of children after they are born. And clearly with embryos, we haven't had a birth yet. So when we're looking at using an agency to gain access or custody to embryos, we're simply guided by the typical adoption process and applying it to the placement of embryos into the custody of another. And there's a reason for that. The reason is most states view embryos, and really all genetic material for that matter, as property. So if you have frozen eggs or frozen sperm or even frozen embryos, most places view that as your property. The same as your couch or your car or any other valuable that you have that's property. However, there are exceptions, like Louisiana. Louisiana is one of the states that's popular for its view on what we call personhood. And according to Louisiana, an embryo created for IVF is juridically a person. Juridically, fancy legal word that means for the purposes of law. So for the purposes of law in Louisiana, an embryo is a person. And then you have variations on this view. Take Massachusetts, for instance, where a written agreement or written intent to donate is recognized, but it isn't valid until at least 4 days after the birth of the child. Now, I'm sure you can see how that could potentially pose some problems if you think someone has donated embryos to you and then they change their mind 3 days after your baby's born. That's why it's so important that you know the laws in the state where you are. So as I always say, like a broken record, seek professional advice in your location before you dive into these kinds of things. Now we'll get back to the typical embryo adoption process for most states. Like I said, most states view embryos as personal property. And so what most of the embryo adoption agencies do is they borrow the processes from the typical adoption process and apply it to embryo adoption. And that's their estimation of how to most fairly donate or to give custody of these embryos to recipients. The most popular phrase used for this process is snowflake children. I know it sounds a bit funny, but of course, snowflake refers to the fact that the embryos have likely been frozen. But there are amazing programs out there like Nightlight Christian Adoption that actually coined that phrase, snowflakes, that help people find embryo donors and facilitate the process of taking on, or as they call it, adopting these embryos. Now, you may be wondering, are there states that have laws specific to embryo adoption or embryo donation? And the answer is there are not a ton of states that do, and they're typically the states that already have laws on the book for other assisted reproductive technologies. But there are some, so it's important that you find the ones that have laws on the books and take advantage of those laws. For most of the states that do have laws, they typically require that there be a written agreement in place between the donors and the recipients of the embryos. Here's a few states that do allow embryo donation in some form or another. First up to bat, we have California. And it's no surprise really that California has laws on the books for embryo donation and embryo adoption because they also have laws on the books concerning other forms of assisted reproductive technologies like surrogacy and egg donation, sperm donation too. And actually, quick note, California has actually made it a crime to steal embryos. And you may be wondering, why in the world did they create a law like that? Well, because somebody stole embryos. You'll have to look it up for yourself, but there's a story that came out of UC Irvine about people at a medical clinic actually stealing the clients' or the patients' frozen embryos. Crazy to think that, right? Only in Hollywood. Colorado is another state that has laws on the books allowing embryo donation or adoption. However, Colorado gives the donor the right to rescind their donation at any time prior to the transfer of that embryo into the uterus of the hopeful mom or the surrogate. Connecticut law requires that fertility centers and clinics provide patients with consent forms that dictate what they want to do with their eggs. They're called disposition forms. So they make sure that every clinic gives those patients a disposition form so there's no question about what to do with the leftover embryos. That's another issue that many clinics are dealing with. They have a stockpile of frozen embryos and maybe no direction on what to do with them. And so you have doctors in those clinics that are afraid to dispose of them because, of course, they don't want to be sued, but the parents have long gone or at least long finished growing their family. So make sure that if you're freezing embryos, you get a consent form with the clinic to at least let them know what they have the right to do with the embryos should you decide you are finished growing your family. Whether you call it embryo donation or embryo adoption, the end result is the same. You're receiving an embryo to grow your family. The nuance comes in how you get it. If you're working through a clinic, they're going to put you through an adoption ringer, so to speak. But if you're getting it directly from a set of parents who have finished growing their family, the process may be a lot more straightforward and easy. Either way, just know you have options. If you've enjoyed this video and you're considering other sides of assisted reproduction like surrogacy, you're in luck. I have something just for you. I call it my stress-free surrogacy training. And in it, I walk you through the surrogacy process. I give you case studies of previous clients of mine who I've helped overcome hurdles and roadblocks on their way to growing their family through assisted reproduction. So if you want that, you can have it for free. Just click the link below and get access to it. I'll see you in the next video.